McRae, settle down.
As the armies of Europe fought to a stalemate on the Western Front, military leaders on both sides looked elsewhere for the key to material advantage and the elusive final victory. To that end, the Allies initiated campaigns in the Balkans and over the Italian Alps. The British Navy and its First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, launched an amphibious landing on the coast of the Gallipoli Peninsula and the Dardanelles. British forces wage a seesaw war in Palestine and in defense of the Suez against the Ottoman Empire. Even in the remote deserts of Arabia and along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, armies add to the carnage of the Great War. The Turks, humiliated in a series of short but bloody wars in the years immediately preceding 1914, were seriously underestimated by the Allies. The Ottoman Empire had been dismissed since the Crimean War as the sick man of Europe, but after victory over the Allies at Gallipoli and the Dardanelles, Turkey's visions of empire were renewed. When the British government realized the vulnerability of its strategic oil supplies from the Persian Gulf, a small military force was dispatched from India and sent to secure the Anglo-Persian Oil Company's installations at Abadah. With the pipehead secured, more troops were sent from India to advance up the Shatt al-Arab to Basra, Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Reinforced once again, the British colonial force pushed up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. 2 infantry divisions and a cavalry brigade made up this improvised army corps under the command of Sir John Nixon. When the Turks resisted vigorously, a second force, under the command of Major General Sir Charles Townshend, was ordered to advance up the less heavily defended Tigris with the goal of capturing Baghdad. The landscape on the road to Baghdad was harsh, seas of drifting sand cresting into yellow dunes, thorn bushes dotting the plains, deep valleys gashing the earth, and jagged rock towers soaring 400 feet high. Everything was baked under the omnipresent blistering sun. Temperatures often reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Townshend drove his men hard through the blazing desert heat. On November 20th, 1915, they reached Ctesiphon, some 25 miles south of Baghdad. Weary and low-spirited, his Indian troops failed in a mishandled attack against entrenched Turks on November 22nd. Townshend was forced to fall back on Kut. There he dug in, confident that he could sit it out until reinforcements of men and supplies reached him. The Turks, now under the command of the former advisor to the Sultan, General Colmar von der Goltz, invested the garrison. The German general was able to throw back a number of hastily organized attempts to rescue Townshend. A final rescue attempt was made on April 16th, but failed. With his men starving, Townshend surrendered. His men were sent on a 1,200-mile death march, in the course of which over 4,000 soldiers died. In August 1916, the arrival of General Sir Frederick Stanley Maude as Commander-in-Chief transformed the campaign. The Turks, still fighting stubbornly, were racked by disease, and they failed to stem Maude's relentless advance. The British followed close on the heels of the retreating Ottoman troops and captured Baghdad without a fight on March 11, 1917. The British troops were greeted with enthusiasm by the residents. Some 9,000 Ottoman troops were caught in the confusion and became prisoners of the British. General Maude issued the Proclamation of Baghdad, which included the line, "Our armies do not come into your cities and lands as conquerors or enemies, but as liberators," a statement still famous among older Iraqis. In spite of what General Maude had to say, the British knew they needed to possess Mesopotamia's oil fields to hold on to their far-flung empire even after the fighting ended. Following the end of World War I, the entire map of Eastern Europe and of the Near or Middle East changed drastically. Four great empires, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Tsarist Russian, and the Turkish Ottoman, dissolved. Winston Churchill became colonial secretary for the British Empire in January 1921. The Middle East was now his bailiwick. His responsibilities were enormous. He was in charge of drawing the map of much of the Middle East, from which the Turks had been forced to pull out. He faced the defiance of a dozen Arab tribes and the inclinations of his Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. The Allies, Britain, France, Italy, and Greece, had imposed an impossible treaty on the defeated Turks, who were now rising under a remarkable new leader, Kemal. Much of Churchill's work was accomplished at a conference in Cairo in March 1921. Churchill's scheme was, in effect, to establish a series of pro-British client monarchies, all of whose rulers would owe Britain a debt of considerable gratitude simply for the fact that they were in power at all. Some scholars contend that the present tribal troubles in Iraq are derived from the lines Churchill helped draw to create its borders. Kingdoms were fabricated from lines drawn on an empty map. Mesopotamia was renamed Iraq. Ignoring the orderly Ottoman system's divisions, they crammed Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Arab, and Kurdish groups into Iraq's artificial borders. Moreover, its tip was snipped off, made into Kuwait, and the tribal leaders most willing to work with the British found themselves elevated to kings. The British then rigged Iraqi elections. Reports from that time indicated that problems among the tribes were foreseen, and that it was clearly understood that there were just not many, if any, permanent solutions for calming the divisive forces at work in that part of the world. Churchill responded, "I hate Iraq. I wish we had never gone to the place." In spite of Winston's grumblings, Britain and its military leaders were confident that they would have say over Iraq's government, and more important, oil, for decades to come. After the new nation was created, a tribal leader named Faisal was crowned King of Iraq. Unfortunately, the new nation of Iraq proved to be rather artificial, leading to conflicts between different tribes. The British learned, while it is relatively easy to enter Middle Eastern countries, tribes and other groups will rise up and fight smart and hard until the enemy becomes exhausted and goes home. Britain's conflicting promises and fabrication of states created deep mistrust and cynicism in Middle Easterners that persist to this day. The British presence was increasingly resented and disliked, creating a long period of violent and costly confrontation. To suppress Shiite and Sunni tribal revolts that followed, Britain pioneered air assaults on villages and the use of artillery shells filled with poison gas, a practice that would continue for decades by many rulers of Iraq. At 2 a.m. on April 30th, 1941, the Second World War came to Iraq. In the pitch black of a desert night, officials in the British Embassy in Baghdad were awakened by Iraqi military convoys rumbling out of the Rashid barracks, across bridges and into the desert toward the Royal Air Force Base near the Iraqi town of Habbaniyah. Immediately, the British ambassador ordered a wireless signal be sent to the air base's ranking commander, Air Vice Marshal Henry George Smart. With his training base not set up or prepared for combat, Smart initially could think of little to do other than sound the general alarm, neglecting to announce the reason. The base speedily degenerated into a madhouse of scared, sleep-sodden, bewildered cadets, instructors, and sundry other personnel. In the spring of 1941, the RAF's No. 4 Service Flying Training School, SFTS, at Habbaniyah held just 39 men who knew how to fly an airplane. As May began, however, those instructors, few of whom had combat experience, and their students, found they were the principal obstacle to a military operation that might well have brought Britain to its knees. The prize over which the campaign raged was the lifeblood of the modern war machine, crude oil. Although Britain had granted Iraq independence in 1927, The British Empire still maintained a major presence there, since Britain's oil jugular passed through that Arab kingdom. On April 3, 1941, militant anti-British attorney Rashid Ali el-Ghaliani led a coup d'etat that set him up as chief of the National Defense Government. This Anglophobic barrister's dearest ambition was to expel by military force all Englishmen from the Middle East. He set about enlisting the assistance of like-minded Egyptians, who vaguely promised to organize an uprising of their army in Cairo. He then contacted German forces in Greece, which had just fallen to Hitler's Third Reich, and informed them of his intentions and solicited their support. He also let Major General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Corps, newly arrived in Libya, know they could count on the support of pro-Axis Vichy French forces in Syria to provide easy access to Iraq. Finally, he told Berlin that he would secure for the Nazis unrestricted use of all military facilities in Iraq, whether or not they were held by the British. Until Rashid Ali's coup, British forces in the region anticipated little trouble beyond scattered anti-British riots by civilians. Rashid Ali's pro-Axis overtures set Prime Minister Winston Churchill at odds with his commander in the Middle East, General Sir Archibald Wavell. Wavell insisted that he had his hands full, as it was, between evacuating Greece, preparing for an expected German invasion of Crete, and dealing with Rommel's recent North African offensive. Churchill recognized the threat that an Axis inroad in Iraq would pose to the empire. It could deprive Britain of crude oil from the fields in northern Iraq, sever its air link with India, and encourage further anti-British uprisings throughout the Arab Mandates. As a first response, the 2nd Brigade of the 10th Indian Division landed at Basra on the night of April 29th, with the rest of the division soon to follow, along with the aircraft carrier Hermes and 2 cruisers. On learning of that development, Rashid Ali mobilized his Iraqi army and Air Force supporters and dispatched them to seize Habbaniyah Air Base. Situated on low ground next to the Euphrates River, the British base was home to 1,000 RAF personnel and the 350 men of the 1st Battalion of the King's Own Royal Regiment. There were also 1,200 Iraqi and Assyrian constabulary organized into 6 companies, but the British could only rely on the 4 companies of Assyrian Christians who devoutly hated Iraqis of different extraction. Aside from the 1st Company RAF armored cars, with its 18 outdated Rolls-Royce vehicles, the principal weaponry available to the base was its aircraft, the most potent of which were 9 obsolete biplane fighters and a Bristol Blenheim Mk-1 bomber. During the chaos following the alarm, the Iraqis arrived and set up artillery along the plateau running along the far side of the base's landing field. This was a ghastly surprise for Air Vice Marshal Smart, who sent out a trainer aircraft to reconnoiter at daybreak on April 30th. The crew's initial report was that the Highlands were alive with what looked like more than 1,000 soldiers with field pieces, aircraft, and armored vehicles. Smart next had his ground crews dig World War I-style trenches and machine gun pits around the base's 7-mile perimeter, pathetic defenses against aerial attack and shelling from elevated positions. On the evening of April 30th, the British ambassador to Iraq radioed Smart that he regarded the Iraqi actions up to that point as acts of war and urged Smart to immediately launch air attacks. He also reported he had informed the Foreign Office in London of the Habbaniyah situation and that His Majesty's diplomats, both in Baghdad and London, were urging the Iraqis to withdraw without response. Meanwhile, by May 1st, the Iraqi forces surrounding Habbaniyah had swelled to an infantry brigade, 2 mechanized battalions, and a mechanized artillery brigade. This totaled 9,000 regular troops, along with an undetermined number of tribal irregulars and about 50 guns. Supporting those ground forces were elements of the Royal Iraqi Air Force, including 63 British, Italian, and American-built warplanes, equal to or newer than those at Habbaniyah. Smart contacted his ambassador in Baghdad to issue an ultimatum for the Iraqis to start withdrawing from Habbaniyah by 8 a.m. on May 2nd. In that way, should they refuse to heed the deadline, the whole day would be available for combat. Smart was still unsure of how far London would support him if he engaged the armed forces of a country not clearly defined as an Axis power. His maddening uncertainty was tardily banished by a May 1st telegram from Churchill. "If you have to strike, strike hard." That emboldened the harried commander to make the first move. He had learned from a radio message that 10 Vickers Wellington bombers from No. 70 Squadron had arrived at Basra. With expectations of their support, he would launch an airstrike at dawn on May 2nd. Although an aerial assault against well-dug-in armored forces had never succeeded before, Smart was upbeat, remarking, "They should be in full retreat within about 3 hours." At 4:30 on the morning of May 2nd, 1941, the first flying machine cranked its engines on Habbaniyah airfield. 30 minutes later, they were showering bombs on the Iraqis. The Iraqis were well dug in on broken ground that provided good cover and concealment, so the British saw few potential targets at first. The Iraqis, unable to draw beads on the airplanes in the darkness, retaliated by shelling the airbase, but the gun flashes gave away their positions. The Brits dropped explosives on the anti-aircraft gun pits, while the Wellington's turret gunners strafed them. The Iraqi anti-aircraft gunners used many tracers, again marking their positions for the British airmen to attack or avoid. After bombing from just 1,000 feet for maximum accuracy, the British carefully scanned the plateau for suitable future targets. Although the Iraqis had been sorely hurt and showed no inclination to launch a ground attack, they were still firmly ensconced atop their elevation, with a variety of field pieces trained on the smoking flying school. Furthermore, that afternoon, Iraqi troops invaded the British embassy in Baghdad and confiscated every wireless transceiver and telephone, leaving the only two significant English outposts in the region isolated from each other. Meanwhile, the Committee of Imperial Defense had transferred command of land forces in Iraq to Middle East Command, compelling Wavell to assemble whatever elements he could spare into a relief unit called Hab Force to march the 535 miles from Haifa to Habbaniyah. Rashid Ali's leaders also appealed for help, but the Germans were preparing for their invasions of Crete and the Soviet Union, and the Italian response was slow. Only the Vichy French in Syria agreed to send arms and German-supplied intelligence to the Iraqis. They also promised the use of Syrian airfields to any aircraft that the Germans or Italians were willing to commit to Iraq. On May 3rd, Smart, noting that the Iraqi artillery had not caused as much damage as he had feared, called for the RAF to launch some preemptive strikes against the Iraqi air bases. Although Rashid Ali's troops kept shelling Habbaniyah, they balked at storming the base. Still, the defenders were suffering much worse than their foes seemed to realize. After 4 days of combat, just 4 of the original 26 Oxfords were still battle-worthy. Pilots also became even scarcer as half-trained cadets died in action or suffered from cracked nerves. On May 6, the trainer aircraft returned from a dawn reconnaissance mission with news that the Iraqis were withdrawing. That encouraged Colonel O.L. Roberts of the 1st King's Own Royals, commander of ground forces at Habbaniyah, to mount an assault to drive the enemy from the plateau. The timing was perfect. The Iraqis, their morale broken at last, suddenly abandoned the heights in a disorderly withdrawal down the Baghdad road toward Fallujah. Meanwhile, 6 Wellingtons from No. 37 Squadron hit Rashid again. That afternoon, the British spotted a column of Iraqi reinforcements approaching from Fallujah, which soon ran into forces retreating from Habbaniyah. In complete disregard for military procedure, both groups stopped on the highway, and personnel jumped from their vehicles to confer, leaving all their trucks, tanks, and armored cars parked in plain view. At that point, the Brits hurled every remaining aircraft they had at the bunched-up mass of vehicles. The 2 airstrikes left the Iraqi convoy in flames. Armed ground personnel and Arab auxiliaries ventured from the airfield and rounded up 408 demoralized Iraqi prisoners, including 27 officers. Counting those POWs, Rashid Ali lost more than 1,000 men that day, compared with 7 British killed and 10 wounded. The next day, the British could find no trace of the enemy near Habbaniyah. It was a smashing victory over Rashid Ali, who now faced the British reprisal with a demoralized army and an air force that barely existed. On the day that the motley fleet of RAF Antiques was reducing the combined Iraqi forces outside Habbaniyah to junk, Luftwaffe Colonel Werner Jungk was in Berlin, being briefed by Chief of Air Force General Staff Hans Jesenek. The colonel's new mission was to organize a special force called Sonderkommando Jungk to be sent to Iraq. When Jesenek stated, "The Fuhrer desires a heroic gesture," Jungk asked precisely what that meant. Jesenek replied, "An operation which would have significant effect, leading perhaps to an Arab uprising, in order to start a jihad or holy war against the British." The Germans were unaware that their erstwhile Mideast allies had already been soundly defeated, and that Habbaniyah's garrison was almost at that very moment receiving a message from Churchill: "Your vigorous and splendid action has largely restored the situation. We are watching the grand fight you are making. All possible aid will be sent." 12 Messerschmitt Me-110Cs, 7 Henkel He-111Hs, and a transport contingent of 20 Junkers Ju-52s and a few Ju-90s were hastily decorated in Iraqi markings. They began flying to Mosul via Greece and Syria on May 11th. On May 12th, British reconnaissance planes discovered several German aircraft in Iraq, and on the 14th, one of No. 203 Squadron's Blenheim spotted a Ju-90 at Palmyra Airport in Syria, confirming Vichy French cooperation in violation of its nominal neutrality. The British attacked Palmyra the same day. It was the first round of hostilities that would ultimately lead to the British invasion of Syria in June. On May 30th, the British ground force, numbering 1,200 men with 8 guns and a few RAF armored cars, lay just outside Baghdad facing an Iraqi division. The RAF's now undisputed control of the air made a great difference, however. The Iraqis refused to engage the dreaded British, and the RAF took over Baghdad's airfield. Realizing the game was up, Rashid Ali fled the capital after embezzling his soldiers' monthly payroll of 17,000 dinars. His followers followed suit, and Iraq's pro-British royal government was restored soon thereafter. The Italians, too, were sufficiently forewarned to depart Kirkuk for Syria on the 31st, burning 2 Fiats that were too damaged to fly out. Sonderkommando Jungk had a more ignominious departure, the last of its surviving personnel escaping overland to Syria on June 10th, leaving behind the wrecks of all 14 Me-110s, 5 He-111s, and 2 transport planes. Those losses were far less damaging than the pounding their prestige had taken in the eyes of the Arabs they had hoped to convert to the Axis side. A quick, sizable German incursion in support of Rashid Ali would have likely succeeded, but Adolf Hitler was too preoccupied with the looming invasion of the Soviet Union to pay much attention to events in obscure Iraq. The implications of the Habbaniyah battle are staggering. In 5 days, a handful of pilots had secured Britain's vital oil supply, as well as having denied Nazi Germany a foothold in the Middle East. After the Second World War, the colonial powers had hoped to return to business as usual in their far-flung empires. The people of their colonial outposts had other ideas. In India, Mohandas Gandhi was resisting British control through mass civil disobedience. In Indochina, Nguyen Sin Kung adopted the name Ho Chi Minh and formed the Viet Minh independence movement against the French. In the early 1950s, new mass-based political parties were formed in almost every African colony. Unlike earlier political organizations, these parties were not restricted to the educated elite. The central demand was for political freedom for the end of colonial rule. In the years following World War II, African nationalism found itself significantly stirred by men like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Nelson Mandela of South Africa. The rapid growth of African nationalism took European colonial powers by surprise. The Italians and the British, followed by the French and then by the reluctant Belgians, eventually responded to the demands for independence. During the first 15 years after the Second World War, almost every Muslim country in the world gained independence from the European powers that had ruled them directly or indirectly before the war. In most parts of the Muslim world, winning independence was a fairly easy process, since the colonial powers had little interest in maintaining direct control against local opposition. The two big exceptions were the Dutch in Indonesia and the French in Algeria. The Dutch lost Indonesia by 1950. The French fought equally futilely in Algeria from 1954 to 1962. The Algerian War proved not only expensive but dangerous to France. The French Constitution collapsed in 1958, to be replaced by another one with a stronger president, and towards the end of the war, the French government was almost overthrown in a military coup set up to prevent France from withdrawing from Algeria. The post-war Arab nationalists believed that the Arab nation had existed as a historical entity prior to the rise of nationalism in the 19th-20th century. The Arab nation was formed through the gradual establishment of Arabic as the language of communication, and with the advent of Islam as a religion and culture in the region. Both Arabic and Islam served as the pillars of the nation.
It's something that's been going on for a long time. You can trace it back to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and their influence. I mean, if you go to more secular states like Egypt, there's an example of where we've seen Muslim radicalism for quite a long time. There and in Algeria, in different places, Syria, it's cropped up. So this is something that's been going on for 50 or 60 years, if not more.
A driving force behind the concept of the Arab nation was the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party was originally formed at a Congress meeting in Damascus, Syria, in 1947. This gathering was inspired by two Syrian nationals, Michael Aflaq and Salah ad-Din al-Bitar, the founding fathers of the Ba'ath movement. Among the few Iraqis at the Congress was Abd ar-Rahman ad-Damin. Damin became the first Iraqi Secretary General of the Ba'ath Party in Baghdad. Back in Iraq, Damin and the party targeted college students, intellectuals, and professionals. Most of those recruited were Sunni Arabs, including one young student named Saddam Hussein. These educated liberal members later became influential politicians in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was born into a peasant family in Tikrit on April 28, 1937. He never knew his father, who disappeared 6 months before Saddam was born. The infant Saddam was sent to the family of his maternal uncle until he was 3. Saddam returned to his mother after she remarried. His stepfather, Ibrahim al-Hassan, treated Saddam harshly after his return. At around 10, Saddam fled the family and returned to live in Baghdad with his uncle, Karaila Tolfa. Tolfa, the father of Saddam's future wife, was a devout Sunni Muslim and a veteran from the 1941 Anglo-Iraqi War between Iraqi nationalists and the United Kingdom. Under the guidance of his uncle, he attended a nationalistic high school in Baghdad. After secondary school, Saddam studied at an Iraqi law school for 3 years, dropping out in 1957 at the age of 20 to join the revolutionary Pan-Arab Ba'ath Party, of which his uncle was a supporter. During this time, Saddam supported himself as a secondary school teacher. Revolutionary sentiment was characteristic of the era in Iraq and throughout the Middle East. In Iraq, progressives and socialists assailed traditional political elites. Moreover, the pan-Arab nationalism of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt profoundly influenced young Baathists like Saddam. The rise of Nasser foreshadowed a wave of revolutions throughout the Middle East in the 1950s and 1960s, with the collapse of the monarchies of Iraq, Egypt, and Libya. Nasser inspired nationalists throughout the Middle East by fighting the British and the French during the Suez Crisis of 1956, modernizing Egypt and uniting the Arab world politically. In 1958, a year after Saddam had joined the Ba'ath Party, officers led by General Abd al-Qasim Qasim overthrew Faisal II of Iraq. The Baathists opposed the new government, and in 1959, Saddam was involved in the unsuccessful United States CIA-backed plot to assassinate Qasim. As a result, he was forced to flee Iraq. In 1964, Saddam returned to Iraq, but was imprisoned. He escaped from prison in 1967 and quickly became a leading member of the party. The following year, Saddam participated in a bloodless coup led by Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr that overthrew Abdul Rahman Arif. Al-Bakr was named president, and Saddam was named his deputy and deputy chairman of the Ba'athist Revolutionary Command Council. According to biographers, Saddam never forgot the tensions within the first Ba'athist government, which formed the basis for his measures to promote Ba'ath Party unity, as well as his resolve to maintain power and programs to ensure social stability.
The 1980s was still a decade of the Cold War. In fact, you could make an argument that the Reagan administration wanted to intensify that Cold War, putting more pressure on the Soviet Union. There was a rejection of the idea of détente. That really goes back to the Nixon administration and Ford with Henry Kissinger. The Carter administration really hadn't used that terminology all that much, but the policies were basically still in place. For example, arms control negotiation with the Soviets was still a central portion of policy. But by the 1980s, the Reagan administration, when they came in criticizing almost every dimension of Carter's foreign policy, including many of the openings towards the Soviet Union. So the idea was, let's intensify this. You might remember that the early 1980s began with a great deal of attention focused on Central America. The idea that places like Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, that those were new frontiers of the Cold War. Some of the brush wars you're mentioning, but not necessarily in the Middle East. The Middle East, the US and the Soviet Union both had client states, for lack of a better word, but the wars that were fought in the Middle East typically weren't about the Cold War. They were much more about localized issues, whereas the conflicts that the U.S. was helping to foment in some ways in Central America were oftentimes framed in the U.S. at least as Cold War issues, although they also had great local dimensions as well. As the 80s went on, Central America became less important. Other issues obviously came up, and in fact, after the 1984 elections and after Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, the Reagan administration started practicing some of the policies that it had rejected when it came in, but didn't use the same terminology, of course, didn't call it détente or anything like that. But it was a little bit of a softening that arguably helped lead to some of the things that ended the Cold War. The CIA, for example, was vastly overestimating how much the Soviet Union was spending on defense, partly because we really didn't understand the economic crises that the Soviet Union was undergoing periodically. So they weren't as well off as we thought they were, which means they weren't spending. I mean, part of the problem was that the way the U.S. estimated Soviet spending was to take into account what the Soviets were buying and then cost it as if it were being built in the United States, with the same kinds of standards and bidding processes and all kinds of stuff. I mean, it turned out to be a method that vastly overstated what the Soviets were spending. I mean, we could count the weaponry they had, but the spending estimates were not great. But I think there is still a kernel of truth to the idea that over the long haul, not just the Reagan administration, but a period of decades, the competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was draining the Soviet Union. Although, you could make a case that it was also draining the U.S. I mean, Vietnam was a very expensive experience for the U.S. I mean, the idea of running big deficits we're sort of used to now, but that was really something that at the Vietnam time was relatively controversial, especially since it was roughly at the same time as the implementation of Johnson's Great Society. So you had some pretty significant increases in government spending, both on the social side and on the military side. Once Vietnam ended, there was some reduction in military spending in the U.S., but the Reagan administration kicked it back up to substantial levels. Back then, I think the number was around $300 billion in those dollars that the U.S. was spending, and that was a significant sum.
Iraq was a strategic buffer state against the Soviet Union, and Saddam was often seen as an anti-Soviet leader in the 1960s and 1970s. Some even suggested that John F. Kennedy's administration supported the Ba'ath Party's takeover. Although Saddam was al-Bakir's deputy, he was a strong behind-the-scenes party politician. Al-Bakir was the older and more prestigious of the two, but by 1969, Saddam Hussein clearly had become the moving force behind the party. As vice chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, Saddam built a reputation as a progressive, effective politician. Saddam moved up the ranks in the new government by aiding attempts to strengthen and unify the Ba'ath Party, and by taking a leading role in addressing the country's major domestic problems, and by expanding the party's following. After the Ba'athists took power in 1968, Saddam focused on attaining stability in a nation riddled with profound tensions. Long before Saddam, Iraq had been split along social, ethnic, religious, and economic fault lines. Sunni versus Shiite, Arab versus Kurd, tribal chief versus urban merchant, nomad versus peasant. Saddam actively fostered the modernization of the Iraqi economy, along with the creation of a strong security apparatus. Ever concerned with broadening his base of support among the diverse elements of Iraqi society and mobilizing mass support, he closely followed the administration of state welfare and development programs. At the center of this strategy was Iraq's oil. On June 1, 1972, Saddam oversaw the seizure of international oil interests, which at the time dominated the country's oil sector. A year later, world oil prices rose dramatically as a result of the 1973 energy crisis, and skyrocketing revenues enabled Saddam to expand his agenda. Within just a few years, Iraq was providing social services that were unprecedented among Middle Eastern countries. Saddam established and controlled the National Campaign for the Eradication of Illiteracy and the Campaign for Compulsory Free Education in Iraq, and largely under his auspices, the government established universal free schooling up to the highest education levels. Hundreds of thousands learned to read in the years following the initiation of the program. The government also supported families of soldiers, granted free hospitalization to everyone, and gave subsidies to farmers. Iraq created one of the most modernized public health systems in the Middle East. With the help of increasing oil revenues, Saddam diversified the largely oil-based Iraqi economy. He implemented a national infrastructure campaign that made great progress in building roads, promoted mining, and developing other energy industries. Electricity was brought to nearly every city in Iraq and many outlying areas. In 1976, Saddam rose to the position of general in the Iraqi armed forces and rapidly became the strongman of the government. As the ailing elderly al-Bakir became unable to execute his duties, Saddam took on an increasingly prominent role as the face of the government both internally and externally. He soon became the architect of Iraq's foreign policy and represented the nation in all diplomatic situations. Saddam was now the de facto leader of Iraq, some years before he formally came to power in 1979. He slowly began to consolidate his power over Iraq's government and the Ba'ath Party. Relationships with fellow party members were carefully cultivated, and Saddam soon accumulated a powerful circle of support within the party. In 1979, al-Bakr started to make treaties with Syria, also under Ba'athist leadership, that would lead to unification between the two countries. Syrian President Hafez al-Assad would become deputy leader in a union, and this would drive Saddam to obscurity. Saddam acted to secure his grip on power. He forced the ailing al-Bakr to resign on July 16, 1979, and formally assumed the presidency. Shortly afterwards, he convened an assembly of Ba'ath Party leaders on July 22, 1979. During the assembly, which he ordered videotaped, Saddam claimed to have found a fifth column within the Ba'ath Party and directed Muyi Abdel Hussein to read out a confession and the names of 68 alleged co-conspirators. These members were labeled disloyal and were removed from the room one by one and taken into custody. After the list was read, Saddam congratulated those still seated in the room for their past and future loyalty. The 68 people arrested at the meeting were subsequently tried together and found guilty of treason. 22 were sentenced to execution. Other high-ranking members of the party formed the firing squad. Saddam was now the absolute power in Iraq.